Hi all, this review is for a book I read back in 2017 and someone just remarked on it or looked at it at the review on Goodreads and that reminded me about it, so I thought I'd talk about it here. I read this in 2017. Back then on Goodreads I'd do a year personal challenge each year. I'd address a topic that I was interested in. One year it was marine biology, in 2017 it was art, and try to expand the number of books on my read shelves, on the shelves that I had read from that type of genre. It was incredibly successful for 2017. I read so many art books. I read about things like the Italian Renaissance that I didn't know much about. I read a lot of Vincent van Gogh books because I love Vincent van Gogh. I read huge numbers. Many of them were very informative. Many of them were very enjoyable. But Rembrandt's Whore by Sylvie Matton was not any of those things. It was not very informative because I am fond of Rembrandt and I already knew a little bit about him. I visited his house when I was in the Netherlands and I knew a fair bit about him. But the way he's described in this book wouldn't really facilitate learning about him in any case. It's information poor, in my opinion. It wasn't enjoyable for reasons that I'll go into later. Now, the lack of information is really disappointing because Sylvie Matton with her husband, Charles Matton? Okay, just forewarning you, I can't pronounce Dutch, so I can't pronounce any of that. I can't pronounce French very well either, and I gather that Sylvie and Charles Matton were French. So just forgive any mispronunciations right from the start. I'm very, very sorry, people from the Netherlands. I tried hard. I even tried to Google this woman's name with a pronunciation, but every time I tried to make Hendrik G S. Whenever I tried it, Google Translate insisted that I was interested in Enrico Iglesias or something, so I gave up eventually. Sorry about that. Anyway, Sylvie Matton, probably Matton, and her husband were filmmakers, and they'd spent 2 years making a film about Rembrandt, which was published in 2001. Since this book, Rembrandt's Whore, was first published in French in 2000? About a year, within a year of the film coming out. It's got to be based on the information that they researched for the film. It's actually quite disappointing how little information they put into it, because they must have had a huge amount of information working on this movie for 2 years. Anyway, Sylvie has got a couple of other books which I haven't read and now don't plan to. I don't know that my complete lack of enthusiasm and enjoyment for Rembrandt's Whore is the fault of her writing or the fault of the translation. It's open-ended with these books as to what exactly did it. I think it's a little from column A, a little from column B. Tamsin Black was the translator. She lives in Switzerland. I don't know where she's from. But she studied French literature and she was awarded a lot of prizes for that. But Rembrandt's Whore is apparently the first book that she's actually translated. I gave it 2 stars out of 5 on Goodreads because I finished it and because it was about a topic that I liked. But in the end, I did a lot of skim reading. I just had to. It was obligatory. So what it's meant to be about is it's a fictional monologue of Hendrik, what's her name? Stoffels, who was Rembrandt's mistress. She was apparently a peasant girl from a garrison hometown, maybe. And she became a servant in Rembrandt's household, and she became his lover, she became his muse, she was painted in any number of paintings. She was 20, I think, when she became his lover or his servant. And the book claims that she became his closest confidant, filling the void in his life resulting from the death of his wife and 2 of their children. Reborn at 20 in Rembrandt's studio as his model and lover, and enlightened by the positive values of beauty, truth, love, and art. Hendrickje, whatever, is fated to discover the hypocrisy and fickleness of Amsterdam society, which ostracizes her and precipitates Rembrandt's final collapse. It's not a great description of the book. It's emotive, over-emotive, and not just in hindsight a little bit ick and unfair to the time period, but I read it anyway. I found it incredibly tedious. It was boring beyond belief. It was a blurred, continuous monologue style of narration, which I don't enjoy. Stream of conscious and blurred internal monologues are in no way different to each other, and I don't feel like large amounts of them facilitate a novel. Not my thing. And what's worse is that I didn't, as well as not enjoying it, I couldn't believe it for a second. I couldn't in any way find it convincing in my heart of hearts that this was the internal dialogue of a very young, almost completely illiterate Dutch woman from the 1960s. 1916s. It does, however, sound remarkably convincing as a middle-aged, 21st century French woman with a solid literary education and maybe a bit of literary pretension, just putting that out there. From good universities, a background of the performing arts. So what do you know, that's the author. I read a whole book about the author pretending inside her head to be a Dutch servant from 1916, and I'm not saying that that book couldn't have been good, but I thought I was reading a book about Rembrandt, and I wasn't, really. So there's this high about blown phrases, which left me continually expecting to find a sentence beginning with, "My dear reader." It was that kind of book. Except that Hendrickje, whatever, the alleged narrator was illiterate and repeatedly informs us so. So this naive, uneducated woman from a rural town had enough nonce to leave home, get a job at Rembrandt's house, and manage it for years. Which, you know what? There's a really good story in there. Someone who could do that, did all the things that the real character did, that could have been an amazing story, but that story is not this story. So, this narrator, however, is constantly mithering in a stream of consciousness, mostly religious, incredibly tedious. No practical teenager who's running a house thinks about God and the devil, often at once, and the narrator can't seem to tell them apart. Every second paragraph of their internal thoughts. I mean, if she'd made it so that Henry whatever thought about sex every paragraph of her internal thought, that's consistent with a teenager, but God and the devil all the time? Really? We get just enough information on historical factors to keep the reader hanging on. The historical aspects were apparently researched with assiduousness, so that was enjoyable, but there wasn't very much of it. You'd have a tiny factoid like veal stew and melon juice. Okay, that's interesting. Give me more. No. Back we go to the God and the devil, having chats about whether Hendrickje should be having sex or something. I don't know. So this woman running this cash-strapped busy household spent no time on practical thoughts. That's unlikely. I suppose the religious overtones were necessary to explain the obsession our narrator has with the phrase Rembrandt's whore. I think that's... What is it in French? It actually does sound quite interesting in French. Moi. That's it. French. Moi. It's been translated into a lot of languages. I can't find the French option. But I did read it before getting this book. Moi, something or other. It was good. It's gone. Whatever. Okay, so having heard Rembrandt's, if you cut out all but say 3 phrases Rembrandt's whore, this book's word count would fall by over 100, I reckon. Now, I've read enough about the period to know that religion was a really important part of Dutch life of the era. It was a practical sort of religion for the most part. And historically, a number of art historians have suggested that Hendrik, whatever, was probably not overly concerned by her legal position. Rembrandt himself was certainly less than active in Christian practice, which I believe he earned a certain amount of bad press from in his era among his patrons. I think maybe from his ex-wife as well. I'm not sure about that. His interest in Christianity was minimal, and it seems unlikely that his lover could sustain thinking and talking about God and the devil every 5 minutes for many years. Rembrandt, however, did paint a lot of really beautiful and dynamic biblical scenes. But let's face it, the Old Testament's got some kick-ass stories, and it's right that a good painter from that era would paint them because he's trying to sell them. Rembrandt needs money. Rembrandt always needs money. So the monologue that we get from Hendriki Jiki is so fractured and fragmented it's often impossible to tell if we're reading about something real or some complicated internal musing, and that is also annoying. Reference to Rembrandt also are difficult to pinpoint in the dialogue most of the time, being interchangeably he, you, Rembrandt, or anything else, sometimes referred to in different ways within a single paragraph. At other times he's described using elaborate metaphors, like roaring lions, and I don't know, I think lions were highly favoured, but there were other ones as well. So she was into comparing his trials and tribulations to the experience of Christ, which would be okay with Hedrigic's extensive knowledge of biblical scenes and stories of antiquities, which is unparalleled. There's Christian apologists out there whose videos who I've seen who knows less religion than this illiterate peasant girl does. It's amazing. So impossible to tell what's a metaphor instead of letting the poor reader just wondering just what the hell they're meant to be reading about. I thought I was going to be reading about Rembrandt. Mostly I wasn't. And when I was, I couldn't always tell. So the paintings were a big thing for me. It's Rembrandt, right? Rembrandt? Paintings? That's kind of why we know about him. But when they were referred to, they were so buried in the florid, overworked, literary, pretentious style that I was left uncertain if a painting was being described at all, or if Rembrandt was being addressed, or if Hendrick was just navigating us through another highfalutin internal pratfall. Eventually I realised there was a list of paintings referred to in the appendices, luckily chronologically, and that was the only way I could sometimes tell if it was a painting being described, or if it was a real painting, or if it was just some sort of internal musing. Now, this by the way is a book that I didn't keep. I kept most of the books from my art year of reading because they were hard to get. This one, I don't care what happened to it. I may have even let my bird chew it before getting rid of it. Now, for the last and most intriguing part of this book, I cannot forget to mention the worms. There were worms everywhere. If Hendrik Ridge is interested in one thing that isn't Rembrandt or the God and Devil, it's worms. There were a lot of them. The first quarter of the book was practically impossible to get through 3 paragraphs without little white worms. Small white worms, with or without teeth. Worms with teeth. Chewing through corpses, in people's guts. Chewing through wood, under the floor. Worms, 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 worms everywhere. White worms, red worms, black worms, teeth worms, worms. Later on we got the occasional brown worm too. And on one standout occasion, blue worms. That was interesting. I get it. A metaphor for death and decay, which seems to be the only thing Hendrik ever thinks about that isn't God, devil, death, decay. I get it already. Please stop. I don't need every paragraph, every page. Again, this is meant to be a 1600s 20-year-old illiterate peasant girl who's elevated to the point of running Rembrandt's household and warming his bed, and all she thinks about is God, devil, and worms. Surely, that many worms don't feature that highly in anyone's imagination, 1600s or not. Okay, that's mostly my rant about the book, which, oh my god, it was so not what I expected. It's very much one of those strange French literature books, and I've enjoyed many of those strange French literature books over the years. Usually many years ago. This book feels old, by the way. So the fact that it was printed in 1999 is really surprising. It feels like it was written in maybe in the 50s and the 60s, when this kind of literature for the sake of literature with no actual topic. Well, I was reading a lot from those areas. Anyway, I assume they were popular back then. So going back to the description that the book provides for itself, fickleness, hypocrisy of Amsterdam society, which ostracizes her and precipitates Rembrandt's final collapse, blah, blah, blah. There's a few things about that are really unfair. Rembrandt was in desperate debt. He had a habit of going to auctions and buying everything in sight, and he used a lot of those items in his paintings, but he wasn't sensible about money at all. And a lot of Rembrandt's final collapse had to do with that, and Henry Ridge managed to get off her thinking about worms in the real life enough to basically financially own him. That would have been interesting to have in this book, but there wasn't much of it. In some books that talk about Rembrandt and his final lover, there's a lot of really dodgy stuff about what her and one of the kids did, and that was interesting. It's totally not in this book, though. I don't remember a single mention of it. Now, as for hypocrisy and fickleness of Amsterdam society, I call BS on that one. It was a very Christian society. I don't think anyone there went around thinking about God and the devil every paragraph of their lives. But they had very strict structural rules. Actually, in Girl with Pearl Earring, both the book and the movie, you get a much better representation of being an artist with all the pluses and minuses to that position in that type of very strict society. So within that strict society, we think of artists in these days as being these Brett Whitleys or, I don't know, Salvador Dali's, who are wild and outside society. But in Dutch society of Rembrandt's times, that wasn't really the case. They were a little bit outside society, but they couldn't afford to be wild. They were given a little bit more leeway than other people, but that society was extremely strict. And having someone like Rembrandt pick up with a peasant girl, there's nothing hypocritical about them not really approving of that. That was outside of their social norms. And I just feel like a book pretending to be about Rembrandt, whether spoken through his lover and muse or anyone else, could have done a bit better job of actually talking about Rembrandt, about his era. It would really have helped if you'd talked about his paintings as well. But that clearly was not the thing that Sylvie Matton wanted to talk about. I guess she wanted to talk about God and the devil and worms. In French. Or French translation. So, if God and the devil and worms are things you really, really want to listen to for 198 pages, remember the worms come in all different colours and some of them have teeth. Worms with teeth. Can't go past that. So for those people, this book will be excellent. If you don't really care at all about Rembrandt, his painting, or anyone else's, then, but you do really like French high literature, we'll just stop with that, hey? If that's the thing you like, this book will probably be very much for you. And some people did indeed love it. A lot of people gave it 4 stars. A lot of people, like myself, did not. But those that did love it, it was mostly because they enjoyed the actual writing style. So if you like stream of consciousness, it might also be for you. Anyway, that's all I really want to say about Rembrandt's whore, which... Why was she so obsessed with calling herself that? I mean, the whole word... Oh, I really hope YouTube doesn't penalise me for this title, by the way. I didn't invent it, YouTube. It's the title of the book, not my fault. Why exactly, as well as being totally and utterly obsessed with God and the devil and worms, she was obsessed with calling herself Rembrandt's whore. So it's a good title for this book. I don't think it's a good title for Hendrikrik. I don't think she would have been that obsessed with it. I mean, she wasn't. A whore is a very specific thing. It's someone, you give someone money for sex. And that's... I can see a little bit of Christian guilt in there for what she was doing, which was sort of outside what the Christian faith wanted people to do in the Netherlands at that stage, but there's just so many obsessions here, and none of them are particularly interesting. Yeah, anyway, if you read it, let me know. If you haven't read it, think good and hard before you do.